Hi, I'm Rabbi Orlofsky. Welcome to the Rabbi Orlofsky Show, episode 42. And whether you are watching on Torah Anytime or wherever you watch or listen to your podcasts, it is so nice to have you along. And like I say, our extended family keeps growing. If you know anybody who you think might enjoy this, might gain from this, it's definitely worthwhile. I try to keep my topics generic enough that you could listen to it whenever. I got an email not long ago from a young lady who had to travel halfway across the country, more than halfway across the country. And she heard about my podcast. She downloaded all of them, listened to it on the whole trip. And I certainly enjoy traveling, and I'm happy to travel with you. So people can join at any time. Yeah, so please feel free to share, if you enjoy this experience, to share it with other people. Okay, we are doing a little bit of a theme in our post-Shavuos weeks, and that is we are talking about topics that are relevant to Matan Torah. And I want to deal with something this week that has always been an issue to me, a serious issue. Let me tell you a story. I travel around the world and I speak. I'm a somewhat inspirational speaker, humorous, entertaining. I try to be relevant. I always say when I speak, I've got 4 goals. I want to say a chiddush, and I want to be entertaining, and I want to be inspiring, and I want to be practical. Those are my 4 elements I try when I go around and I speak. But there's, I don't know if they still have it, but at one point, I know the Kolo and Elizabeth used to make a Yom Iyun. Fathers would come with their children, and they would come for a Yom Iyun. So somebody I know, I happened to be in America for Thanksgiving. They were having a Yom Iyun. So they asked me to come and speak. So I called Rosh Shiva, Rosh Kollel. I said, so what should I speak about? He says, speak about? Gemara, Rashi, Tosfos, Rambam. You give up my makomos and you give a shir. And I said, well, I said, well, this is the first time I've ever been asked to do this. So I prepared a sugya, Oike Kedusha L'Mafreya. And the reason I took that is because usually when I give a shir, it's Gemara, Rashi, and Tosfos. I don't usually do Rambams. But there's one Rambam over there because the Rabbeisa Rashi, the Kesef Mishnah says, is in fact the Rambam Shita. Said, okay, so I prepared the Makomos and I got ready to give the shir. And he calls me up the day before, and he says to me, people say you don't bring an Orlofsky to give a Gemara shir. He said, so give, 2/3 of the time the Gemara shir, and the last third do whatever, your usual shtick, whatever it is that you do. And that's what I did. And he said to me at the end, I made a mistake. Because the people were loving the Gemara shir. Now, here happens to be one of the great secrets. I give a great Gemara shir. I always have. I shouldn't say I always have. It took me a while to get it down. I give a great Gemara shir. The only thing I still do in Eretz Yisrael is I give a Daf Yomi in the morning. And for the most part, I that's all I do. But I used to teach a Gemara shir. In fact, when I left one particular yeshiva, my Talmidim came to me, a group, delegation of Talmidim, and they said they're going to take me to Din Torah to demand that I give a Gemara shir, because they've been in many shiurim and they never had any shir that was as good as mine. Now, I think that's an exaggeration, but not by much. Anyway, so Baruch Hashem, so I've been pretty successful at doing this. And there's a challenge. Most people do not enjoy learning Gemara. That's a fact. And what's the reason for that? There's a couple different reasons for this that I'm going to try to address in the time that we have together today. But Ma'ahavti sarasecha kol hayom hisichasi. How I love the Torah. I love the Torah. I was teaching in a particular yeshiva, and I came in the first year. I was giving a second year shir. And there was a guy in the shir. He was only staying for 6 months. At the end of the 6 months, he said to me, I came back only on condition that I didn't have to learn Gemara. And that was the deal I made with the Rosh Yeshiva, because I hate learning Gemara. And he agreed. And he was setting me up with other stuff to do. But he says, listen, there's a new Rebbe teaching second year. Why don't you give it a try? Now, I never would have known this. He was one of the best guys in shir. He was doing great. And he said, if I knew that Gemara could be that enjoyable, I would have learned my whole life. Now, that's a problem. It's a problem if people don't enjoy it. And I don't mean do it, and I don't mean master it. I'm talking about enjoy it, where it's better than what's out there. Famous story with Rav Aaron Kotler, where this guy was helping him collect money to open up Lakewood. At the end of the day, the guy sits down and he opens up the newspaper. Rav Aaron looks at him. He says, why don't you open up a Gemara? He says, don't worry, Rabbi, I have my Olam Haba. Yeah, I have my world to come because I'm helping you. I have my Olam Haba. Rav Aaron said, I'm not talking about Olam Haba, I'm talking about Olam Hazeh. I'm talking about this world. If a person could enjoy learning in this world, there's nothing greater. They tell a story of this scientist who came to, who had worked with Einstein, and he said to Reb Moshe Soloveitchik, he says, I curse your father Reb Chaim all the time. And she says, why? He says, I don't believe in God, I don't believe in all this stuff, but I can't stop learning Torah. He made it so interesting, he made it so exciting. So exciting. What does that mean? I may have told the story already. I don't remember. I heard from my son, who heard from his Rebbe, who heard from his grandfather, who heard from Reb Baruch Ber, who was there. The first shir Reb Chaim Soloveitchik gave in Volozhin. And sitting around the table were all the people who became the famous Rosh Yeshivas whose Torah we learned today. And he asked, he brought the Ksais, and he asked the Ksais' kasha. He says, what do you say? And everyone ran around the room and gave Terutzim. And he goes around and knocks off everybody's answers. And then he shows how the Ksais, in a few words, was anticipated all of their answers. Okay? Had everyone's attention. And he gave an answer. And he says, oh, brilliant. And then he knocks it off, and he shows how the Ksais also knocked off his answer. People were stunned. And then he gives an even better answer. This is how I heard the story. The people were dancing on the tables. And then he knocked it off. And he showed how the Ksais thought of that one too. He says it was like Tisha B'Av. And then he gave another answer. And it went on like this for 3 hours. When you can learn Torah on a level, with that level of excitement, that's what Torah is supposed to be. So how do we make Torah come alive? How do we make Torah come alive? I want to start by saying the following, because this is so incredibly important, especially in our day and age. I was at a bris, and this Rav was speaking, and he said the following. Just like you go into a bris, so you should go into Torah chuppah masim tovim. How do you go into a bris? Dressed up in a fancy outfit, carried out on a pillow, and before you know it, you're bleeding and crying. So we understand that's what marriage is, right? But that's also what Torah is. He told the story about this father was walking with his son, and they meet the Rebbe. And the Rebbe says to the little boy, so, do you love the Torah? And he says, no, Rebbe, I don't love the Torah. So the father gives him a look. And the Rebbe says, no, he's saying right. Because there's a reality. There's a certain base level of mastery that you have to accomplish in order for it to become enjoyable. What do I mean? I watch people learning how to play the piano. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. And you're practicing chords. There's a practice that goes into it. There's a lot of donkey work that goes into it. But once you master it, then you could just sit down and start making the most beautiful music. But it takes time to master. People don't mind mastering something that they enjoy. Something they don't enjoy, they don't. And so therefore, you could have kids who are sitting outside. No, not sitting. They're running around outside on the hot asphalt, bouncing a ball, trying to get it into a basket because it's important to them. And they're going to get it. I knew somebody who was a concert flutist. And I asked him, after he became firm and he was learning yeshiva, how come you never play the flute? And he said, if you don't have 8 hours a day to practice, it's not worthwhile. 8 hours a day. Now, I was a magician. I mentioned this in an earlier podcast. I wasn't a very good magician, I'll be honest with you. I was a very entertaining magician, but from the point of mastery. I knew certain tricks and I would practice them and I would get by with my, personality and, things. But I saw people do the same trick. I knew how the trick was supposed to be done. I knew what they were doing and it looked like magic. It was just absolutely amazing. They had mastered these skills. But they spent hours and hours and hours practicing it to be able to get it to the point that they had a mastery. The average guy goes into shir. They assume the position. Go ahead, Rebbe. Say anything that you think might interest me. Now, Torah is a dynamic. If you want to sit back, now, don't take this the wrong way. Chas v'shalom. When I was growing up, we had a Jastrow dictionary, an Aramaic English dictionary. There was almost no word in there that you ever found in the Gemara, unless you were able to conjugate Aramaic. And if I could conjugate Aramaic, I probably wouldn't need your dopey dictionary, because I just didn't speak Aramaic. Conversational Aramaic wasn't my thing. When I was in Chavetz Chaim, people used to go to Queens College and try to get credits for different courses that they offered. There was a Professor Katzenellenbogen, and he had grown up from, and so he knew. So he would fahir these yeshiva guys on whatever they were trying to get credit in, yeah? So for my time, he says he wrote down Aramaic. He might credit for Aramaic. So he says to him, conjugate the verb to come. Okay, I know asa, I know how to conjugate it in that past, present, past, future, first person, second. I don't know how to do that, obviously, right? But Jastrow was very hard. If you got really desperate, you took out the Sansino Gemara. Now, the great thing about the Sansino Gemara was that it was written on a level that it was easier to learn Aramaic than to try to figure out the English that was in this, especially because half of it was Latin anyway, yeah? And every now and then they would write out things in Greek, and it really wasn't, it was the antithesis of user-friendly. It was not user-friendly. And then they came with the Art Scroll Gemaras, which are incredibly user-friendly. And it says that's what they set down to do, to make it user-friendly. And that's why when a person is trying to work through a piece of Gemara, and they get stuck on something, they go to the Art Scroll, and they just went to look up one thing. And before you know it, they're sitting here turning pages. Amud Beis. And they just keep turning. Why? Because it's so interesting. It's so user-friendly. Pictures and charts and maps and pop-ups, Can you help the Meraglim find their way back there? Now, I have made this joke before, and Balabatim come over to me very insulted, and they said, I finished Shas with the Art Scroll. I never could have done it otherwise. And kol kavod. I'm not trying to take away from it. And trust me, if you go through the Art Scroll with all of the footnotes, you have a pretty good hold on the Gemara. But the secret to learning, to get the geschmack out of learning, is you have to work hard. I still resent the fact that my Talmidim have the Divrei Maskov, the headings in Rashi in bold print. I didn't have that when I was growing up. We had to search around to see where we were. And you have to admit, the Gemara itself is distinctly not user-friendly. It's in Aramaic with no punctuation, no capitalization. You don't know where it starts and where it ends. And you're sitting there trying to piece the words together. And sometimes you're sitting there looking up all the words. The bear went into the forest with the eagle. What does that mean? It's a proverb. Ah, great. You know, it means it's usher. But what do you... So you're sitting there working hard. But here's what you won't find. When a person has it more or less spoon-fed to them, or you know, they take something where it's set up for them. You won't see that excitement that you can see in a yeshiva when a person is struggling. You see a person trying to get pshat, trying to understand what's going on, and they're working hard. Sometimes hours, sometimes days. I remember during all my years in yeshiva, I managed to avoid ever having to say a chabura. Chabura means that you have to prepare your own little, like, you know, chiddush and Torah and present it. I always managed to get out of it. You know. So one time I was in a kollel and there was no way I could get out of it. So I came up with a good question and I worked on it. I couldn't come up with anything. I went to the Rosh Kollel. Shaiki Bakst. So it's stark. And I said to him, I can't find an answer. I'm stuck. He said, what time did you go to sleep last night? I said, I don't know, 1 o'clock. He says, you think you're going to figure out a chabur going to sleep 1 o'clock in the morning? So when I'm working on a chabur, I'm up all night. I go to sleep thinking about my chabura. I wake up in the morning thinking about my chabura. I eat, drink, and live my chabura. I was like, okay. And I went back to work, and I'll never forget, I finally figured out what I think was the answer. It was a chiddush. And I said it over, and everybody was amazed. But that thrill that comes because I figured it out, because I found my piece of Torah, that's an unbelievable thing. That's a thrill, but that thrill comes from effort. And once you get the effort, once you put in the effort, then you're able to do it. But you have to know that if you're going to only eat food that was chewed up for you by other people and then spit out on the plate so that you can eat it, it'll be very easy to eat, but it won't be very tasty. And good real learning comes with yigiyah. It comes with effort. You have to be prepared to invest in it. And therefore, I have no problem if you want to have a B'kiyah Seder and you're using different kind of aids to help you get through it, etc. But you have to have at least some time during the day where you're just sitting and working on a kasha, where you're just struggling to understand it, where you find yourself, you know, like... Now, here's another big problem. And I don't know why they do this, but I'm always amazed when people teach Gemara this way. You read a line, you translate it, you read a line, you translate it, you read a line, you translate it, you read a line, you translate it. There's a question and there's an answer. There's a question and there's an answer. There's a proof, there's a this, that. But when you're all done, you don't have a picture. So I would sit down when I give a shir, and I'd start with a question. What do you think? You know, people would start to discuss it, and after a while, you know, people would come up with basically two approaches. And I say, okay, what you're saying is Rabbi Yochanan, and what you're saying is Reish Lakish. And that's what the Gemara is going to say. And then we're going to ask 3 questions on Reish Lakish, and Reish Lakish is going to answer them. And then we're going to ask 1 question on Rabbi Yochanan, and he's going to be disproven, and that's how the Gemara is going to go. Now let's look at it inside. But I've had times when I wrote out the steps of the Gemara, and you have one line where it's a question on it's an answer to the question, to the answer, and the question, the answer, and the question, on the statement. And there's a whole line there. And you don't see the big picture. You have to first figure out what's going on. I don't know why people do this. Rebbeim always do this. You know, I would ask a question. And they'd say, yeah, the Gemara ask it later on. I said, what does it say? Hey, you'll see, you'll get there. So what's the matter? You worried about ruining the surprise? I'll be surprised anyway. I found out about surprise parties and I put on a surprise face anyway. It's not a problem. Hey, you'll see. So of course, with my kind of a mind, I get stuck on that question. Just tell me what it says. Why do we have to play these games? Why do we get stuck? So there's a lot of depth to learning, and there's a lot of questions. But the Poshup Shot, what's happening, that should be clear as day. When I taught in Derech, so Rabbi Lazarus, he used to give what he called the no-fail test. Because the test was the Shakla V'Tarya. What's the question? What's the answer? What's the question on the answer? What's the question? What's the answer? What's the question? All the steps of the Gemara. And you just had to fill them out. And if you didn't get an 80, you took the test again. And you kept doing it until you got it down. Because the purpose of the test was for you, at the end of the day, to understand what the Gemara is saying and what the steps are. That's the goal. So then you could talk about the lumdus, then you could talk about the depth and the thinking and all the kind of things that you can go to work on. But first you have to make sure you have clear what the steps are and where you're going. How many times have I seen people when I was in yeshiva, so I would go to the Shalom Meshiv, and he'd always get that nervous look. I'm used to that kind of look, where they'd like to be someplace else other than here talking to me. Yeah. So one time I asked him, I said, why do you get so nervous when I come by? I'm not one of the better guys in yeshiva. So he says, you make me nervous because you ask easy questions. Hard questions are easy to answer because they're based on a whole bunch of mistakes. So does the kinyan work like this or work like that? What is the chalais over here? Yeah. He says, but I know already what you're coming to ask. You want to know what these two lines are doing in Tosfos. I said, yeah, that's what I want to know. No one knows what those two lines are doing in Tosfos, but you're the only one who's going to ask it. Because to me, I want to understand what the steps are, what's going on. And the more you engage people. So during preparation, I would go around to the chavrusas, and I'd say, what do you think Rashi's saying? I'd say, Rashi's saying like this, and maybe the other chavrusa would say, he's saying like that, he's saying that. What's he saying? I said, I don't know, I'm trying to work it out. You know? I would just go around from chavrusa. Challenge them. Make it something that they care about. Somebody said this to me once, says, when you're in yeshiva, all you hear all day is a question and answer, question and answer. Why? Because he goes, but after you finish building up a question, everyone cares about the question. That's got to be the goal. You have to care about it. And at the end of the day, there has to be something that's relevant. And I always say that. There's not one thing that I've learned that I wasn't able to make some practical application. I was teaching Gittin in Or Sameach. A guy throws a get from his roof into his wife's courtyard. It catches on fire on the way down. Did the chotzer already make a kinyan on it, the courtyard already acquire the get? Someone says, why are we learning this? Why doesn't he just give her the get? Or we were learning about how a guy will send a get and then he'll cancel it out in front of two witnesses and she won't know about it, and then she'll get married on the base of the get and they'll have mamzer. I said, why would anyone do this? And I said, because when a marriage goes bad, there's no limit to what people will do to push each other's, sore spots. It'd be nice if everybody could be nice. But when you see something go wrong, we were doing Zvachim. I'm going through Pigel. Pigel is that if I have the wrong thought when I'm bringing the korban, the Kohen who's bringing the korban thinks we're going to eat this on Tuesday and you can only eat it till Monday, it's no good. So someone says, what's the relevance of Pigel? I said, it's to teach you that your thoughts have impact. And what you think and what your intentions are can make an impact in this world. And so it goes with everything. Everything can be relevant. Everything can be something that we're learning from. There's a reason HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave us the Torah. And it has to be relevant to us today in our own lives. But sometimes, in order to be able to figure that out, you have to work. So you want to get a geschmack from your learning? And that's why if you've ever been to Beis Medrash and you see somebody working really hard and they suddenly figure it out, these people are unbearable. Oh, I figured out Pshat in the Tosfos. Let me tell it to you. I'm not learning that Masechta. No, that's okay. I'll explain it to you. The Gemara says like this, because I'm not holding it. No, I'll tell it to you. There's a question in Torah, and he wasn't. Why? Because he worked hard on it's his Torah, and it's so exciting. It's such a geschmack. That's got to be the goal. That we enjoy it, that it's exciting, that it's alive, that it's real. And in Mitzvah Hashem, every one of us, we were Makabel Torah and Shavuos, and now we have to figure out how to appreciate the gift that we got. There's nothing worse than getting a gift and not figuring out how to put it together and how to use it. So you may not be able to program the clock on your microwave oven, but you have to be able to get an appreciation of the Torah that you're learning. So that's it for this episode. If you want to find out more about this program, go to RabbiOrlofsky.com/podcast. If you would like to make a particular comment on this particular episode, go to RabbiOrlofsky.com/podcast/42. If you want to find out about upcoming events, go to RabbiOrlofsky.com/events. If you would like to contact Rabbi Orlofsky, go to RabbiOrlofsky.com/contact. And if you would like to sponsor an episode, and I almost forgot to mention, but Achrei Chaviv, this episode is being sponsored anonymously. So thank you. And if you would like to be a sponsor and have all that schus, we don't have to mention your name. You know who you are. And you're being Mechazek Torah, Mechazek Klal Yisrael. So go to RabbiOrlofsky.com/podcast and click on sponsor and episode. My name is David Orlofsky, and this is the Rabbi Orlofsky Show.